She found him at the bottom of the Mercy Street steps at 2:14 in the morning, which she knew because she checked her phone when she heard the sound. Not a cry. Nothing that dramatic. Just a specific quality of stillness that did not belong to an empty stairwell, and that her body registered before her mind caught up. He was sitting with his back against the concrete wall, legs extended, one hand pressed flat to his side in the particular way that people press wounds when they are trying to be calm about them. His suit was the kind of suit that cost more than her monthly rent. His shoes were the kind of shoes that had never been intended to touch wet pavement. His face was. She would think about this later, when she had time to think. Not the face of a man who had been ambushed. It was the face of a man who had expected this, who had made a calculation that this would be the cost, and had paid it, and was now in the process of deciding what came next. The rain was November rain, the kind that doesn't fall so much as materialize, finding every gap in every collar, turning Chicago's concrete into something that held cold the way it held nothing else. She was on her way home from a double shift. She had $23 in her wallet, a leftover half sandwich in her bag from a vending machine at 9 o'clock that she had been saving because she knew there was nothing at home, and a uniform jacket that was one size too large because she had bought it for warmth rather than fit. She was 29 years old and tired in a way that lived in her bones and not just her muscles. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been running on function for so long that rest has started to feel like something that happens to other people. She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she crossed to the wall, crouched down, and said, "Where?" He looked at her. His eyes were dark and entirely focused, which told her his head was clear, which narrowed the options to chest or abdomen, because a clear head with a hand pressed to the side was almost never the arm. "Left side," he said. "Not deep. I've had worse." "I didn't ask for a review," she said. She unzipped her jacket without further discussion and pressed it against his side. The thing she would not be able to explain to anyone later was why she did not hesitate. She was not a medical professional. She was not a person who had training in this specific situation. She was a person who had spent 4 years watching the city's systems from the inside. The hospitals, the service corridors, the loading docks and maintenance tunnels that connected one face of Chicago to the other. And who had learned, in the way of people who exist in the infrastructure of other people's lives, that hesitation was a luxury and a wound was a logistics problem. And a logistics problem had a solution. She pressed her jacket to his side and she looked at him and she said, "Do you have people I should call? Or is calling people the problem?" He held her gaze for one long moment. "Second option," he said. "Okay," she said. "Then we do this differently." The world Chicago at 2 in the morning was a different city than Chicago at noon. Brianna Okafor knew both versions, had always known both, had navigated between them her whole life with the pragmatic fluency of someone who understood that the same city was multiple cities depending on what time you were inside it and what you were carrying when you moved through it. She had grown up on the South Side in a house that had been purchased by her grandmother and maintained through a combination of stubbornness and denial of the specific slow processes by which houses deteriorate. Her parents had died. Her father when she was 22. Her mother 14 months later. The second death having a quality that the first had prepared her for, in the way that a warning can prepare you for a collision without preventing the impact. And left behind a younger brother in his last year of high school who needed someone to make sure his life continued, and she had been the someone. She had made that decision without ceremony. She had simply looked at what existed and made an inventory of what was required, and she had begun. That had been 7 years ago. Deshawn was 24 now and in his third year of an environmental engineering degree at UI Chicago, and she had not told him, not once, what the double shifts cost her, or what she had not done with the years between 22 and 29 that she might otherwise have done. He knew, in the way younger siblings know things they are never explicitly told. He had offered, twice in the last year, to take on loans. She had declined with the specific calm of someone who has made a decision and does not require it to be revisited. She worked as a facilities coordinator at St. Agatha Medical Center on the overnight rotation, which meant, in practice, that she knew everything about how a large institution maintained itself in the hours when no one was looking, which corridors stayed unlocked and which required codes, which freight elevators were on the maintenance schedule and which could be used without triggering the log, which loading dock received which deliveries, and at what hours. How the underground service tunnels connected the main hospital building to the parking structure, and the parking structure to the old annex that had not been in active use since 2019, but was still powered and still temperature-controlled because the paperwork to close it properly had been sitting in a facilities committee queue for 3 years. She knew these things the way she knew everything, not through particular interest, but through the accumulated observation of someone who has been moving through the back architecture of a building for 4 years and has learned it the way you learn the layout of your own apartment, without thinking, with the body, in the dark if necessary. She was not impressive to look at. She knew this, and had made her peace with it in the specific way that people make peace with things they have decided not to spend energy on. She was medium height, medium build, wearing a uniform that was designed for function rather than presentation, carrying a bag that contained the remnants of a 9 o'clock sandwich and a transit card, with enough balance for 2 more rides, and a set of keys to a building that employed her, but did not particularly see her. She had natural hair she kept pulled back on shift because it was easier. She wore no jewelry because she worked with machinery. She had not been on a date in 18 months because she worked the overnight rotation and dated the day shift, and those two things did not coexist easily. She was, in all the ways that the world measured such things, nobody in particular. This was not a problem she had found time to address. Choi Sung-jin owned the Yongsan Group. What this meant, in practice, was that he owned a significant portion of the commercial real estate between the Loop and the river, 2 of the city's 3 largest private security contractors, a construction firm that had built or refurbished 11 public buildings in the last decade, including 2 city hall annexes and a courthouse, and enough influence in the architecture of Chicago's civic and business infrastructure that the word own was, in a technical sense, insufficient. You did not own a city. You simply arrived at a point where the city and your interests had become so thoroughly interlocked that the question of who was serving whom had lost its meaning. He was 42 years old. He had come to Chicago from Seoul at 26, with a mandate from his father's organization to establish a Western presence. And he had done so with the specific kind of success that made the people who had sent him slightly nervous. Because the scale exceeded what had been projected, and exceeded it in ways that suggested the success was personal rather than institutional. This was accurate. Choi Sung-jin had not built what he built because he had been told to. He had built it because it was the only language in which he had ever been fluent. He was known for 3 things. He was known for never raising his voice, which the people who had heard him at his quietest understood was not a sign of gentleness, but of a man for whom volume was an amateur's tool. He was known for patience, the kind that did not run out, that sat in a room long after everyone else had grown uncomfortable and waited for the room to become what he needed it to become. And he was known in the more private architecture of his world for a specific quality of loyalty, not given lightly, but, once given, absolute in a way that made it the most valuable thing he offered. He had been offered many things over the course of his career. Money, which was abundant and insufficient. Power, which he possessed and was insufficient. Loyalty from a specific category of person who had looked at him clearly and chosen him anyway. This was the thing he had rarely been offered and had never been able to refuse. The wound beneath all of it was this: he did not know how to be seen as a person. He knew how to be seen as a position, a resource, a threat, an ally, a target. He had spent 16 years perfecting the apparatus of being Choi Sung-jin, the Yongsun Group, the man who owned the city's bones. He had forgotten, somewhere in those 16 years, what it felt like to be in a room where none of that mattered. Where he was simply a man. Where what he needed was what anyone would need. For someone to look at the situation clearly and respond to what was actually in front of them. He had been sitting at the bottom of the Mercy Street steps because 3 members of his inner council had spent the last 6 months building a structure that was designed to remove him. Not kill him, they were too careful for that. Remove him. Transfer control through a legal mechanism that required his incapacitation or demonstrated incompetence, and provide the incapacitation themselves through a sequence of events that had culminated. Tonight, in a knife and a stairwell and a calculation he had been aware of for 2 months, and had not moved on, because he had needed to know the full shape of it before he acted. Now he knew the full shape. His jacket was ruined. His phone had gone into the drainage channel at the base of the steps. His 3 closest men were currently in meetings he had arranged, on his instruction, in 3 separate buildings across the city. Because he had not known tonight was the night, and had not wanted to telegraph his awareness. He was alone, and wounded, and in the rain, and a woman in a too large uniform jacket was pressing that jacket to his side and asking him, with the brisk practicality of someone who had decided this was a logistics problem, whether he needed her to call anyone. He had been in this city for 16 years. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Inciting collision, she made 3 decisions in the following 4 minutes, each one building on the last. Each one the kind of decision that looks unremarkable in retrospect, and is in fact the kind of decision that divides a life into before and after. The first decision was to apply pressure properly. She repositioned his hand over the jacket and pressed the heel of her palm on top of it, leaning her weight in at the correct angle, which she knew because she had watched enough trauma arrivals at St. Agatha to understand that the angle of pressure mattered, and most people got it wrong. He looked at her hand, then at her face. "You've done this before," he said. "I've watched," she said. "Hold this." He held it. She unzipped the front pouch of her bag and removed the transit card, because the card was the only flat, rigid object she had, and she needed to be able to check the depth of the wound without moving the jacket completely. She worked efficiently, with the focused calm of someone who does not have time for a different affect. And she did not look at his face while she was doing it, because looking at faces took attention she needed elsewhere. "Lateral intercostal," she said, half to herself. "You're right, not deep. But you need this closed." "I need a phone," he said. "You said calling people was the problem. A different kind of phone." "I have a phone." He looked at her. A look that was, she would realize later, the beginning of something. A look that was not assessment exactly, but a version of it that had more of the assessor's actual attention in it than assessment usually did. "Why would you let me use your phone?" "Because you're bleeding on a public stairwell and it's almost 3 in the morning, and the answer to that is apparently not to call someone, which means you have a reason, and your reason is not my business. But a man with a reason not to call an ambulance does not need me making his night more complicated." She looked at him evenly. "You can use my phone or not. I'm not going to disappear either way." A silence. November rain moved across the top of the stairwell and ran in thin streams down the concrete to where they sat. "What's your name?" he said. "Brianna, Choi Sung-jin," he said. She did not react to this the way most people would have reacted to this. She said, "I know who you are." "Then you know that this is more complicated than it looks." "Yes." She pressed the jacket more firmly. "Do you want the phone or not?" CTA Bridge, welcome back, my bold hearts and midnight witnesses. If you are new here tonight, hit that subscribe button and that like button before we go any further. Our dark romance family is built by every single one of you, and your click is how these stories keep coming. Drop your city in the comments, because I genuinely want to know where you are right now. Every city, every country, every time zone watching this, you are why this exists. Now find your place and get settled. Because we are about to go deep into what happens when a woman who has spent 7 years being invisible to everyone around her is finally truly seen by the last man on earth she expected to be looking. The story deepens. She got him out of the stairwell using the St. Agatha annex. She had not planned this. She had planned to hold the jacket in place until whoever he called arrived, then walk the remaining 6 blocks to her apartment and go to sleep. Because she had a shift in 11 hours, and her body was already conducting an inventory of grievances that she was choosing not to fully itemize. That had been the plan. Then he had made his call, brief in Korean, 3 sentences, and told her that his people would be at his River North office in 40 minutes, and the question of where he spent those 40 minutes was presenting a problem that the Mercy Street stairwell was not solving. She had thought for approximately 10 seconds. "There's an annex," she said. "What kind of annex?" "The kind that's warm, empty, and not on any map that the people who might be looking for you would think to check." She met his eyes. "I work facilities at St. Agatha. I know every building in a 4-block radius that is currently unlocked from the inside." He looked at her for a moment that she later identified as the moment he made his own decision, a different category of decision from the knife and the stairwell and the 40-minute calculation, a decision that did not belong to the Yongsan group or the architecture of his power, but to something older and quieter than either. "All right," he said. She helped him up with the practiced efficiency of someone who had moved people who didn't want to be moved many times before. Not pulling, not pushing, just providing the specific counterweight that made standing easier, then staying at the right distance as he walked, close enough to catch if necessary, far enough to allow the dignity of managing it himself. She understood this distinction. She had learned it at her father's side. The annex was exactly what she had described: warm, powered, empty, operating on its own quiet logic of maintenance cycles and climate control, untouched by the part of the city that was currently interested in Choi Sung-jin's location. She brought him to the old staff room on the 2nd floor, which still had its furniture and its first aid kit on the wall, and she sat him in the chair nearest the radiator, and she opened the kit, and she worked. He did not make a sound while she worked. She noted this, not as remarkable exactly, but as specific. The particular silence of someone who had learned, long ago, to maintain control of the surface, while whatever lived beneath it did whatever it needed to do. She knew that silence. She had worn it herself, through both funerals and through every double shift since. "You're going to need this properly cleaned when your people get here," she said. "I can close it well enough for 40 minutes. Not well enough for permanent." "Understood. You've been cut before." "Yes, more than once." "Yes." She pressed the closure strips at the angle that would hold best and said, without looking up, "Does it ever get easier? Expecting it?" A pause. "No," he said, "but it gets known. You learn the weight of it." She looked up at that. He was watching her face with that look again, the one with the assessor's actual attention in it. "Yeah," she said quietly. "You do." She had told herself, cleaning up the kit and not thinking about the fact that she was in an abandoned hospital annex at 2:45 in the morning with a man who owned the city she lived in, that the next 40 minutes would be the whole shape of this. She would get him to his people. He would disappear back into the architecture of his world. She would walk home in the rain. This was reasonable. This was what made sense. Then he said, "Tell me why you're awake at 2 in the morning." She looked at him. "Overnight shift," she said. "You said you work facilities at St. Agatha." "Yes." "Why overnight?" She considered not answering. She had a functional relationship with not answering personal questions, had developed it over 7 years as a defense against a specific category of conversation that required more of her than she had available. Something about the annex, about the fluorescent quiet of it, about the rain against the window and the fact that she had just spent 20 minutes putting a man back together in the dark, made not answering feel like more effort than answering. "My brother's tuition," she said. "Overnight differential is 40% more. It's been 7 years." He was quiet. "Your parents?" he said. "Both gone. And you've been covering him since?" "Yes, alone. Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Not with pity. She would have ended the conversation immediately if it had been pity. With something that was closer to recognition, the particular expression of someone who has been performing a solo load for a long time and knows from the inside exactly what that costs. "What does he study?" he said. "Environmental engineering." Something moved in his expression. "That is a field that matters." "I know," she said. "That's why. Not just because he's your brother. No, because he's going to be good at it, and the world needs people who are good at things that matter." She paused. "He would have found another way if I hadn't helped. He's stubborn like that. But I wanted him not to have to." He was quiet for a long moment. "My father ran the Yongsun group until his death. He left it to me because I was the eldest, and because he believed, correctly, as it turned out, that I was the most suited to it." He said this without pride, which was the tell. It was simply a fact about a life that had been organized around a thing he had not entirely chosen. I have never asked myself, until recently, what I would have chosen instead. She looked at him. "What would you have chosen?" He seemed surprised by the question, surprised that she'd asked it directly, surprised by his own willingness to sit with it. "Architecture," he said after a moment. "Real architecture. Buildings that were designed to work for the people inside them rather than to communicate something about the person who built them." She looked around the annex, at the practical, human-scaled ceiling height, the windows placed for light rather than aesthetics, the worn linoleum floors that had been cleaned 10,000 times by people like her. "Like this," she said. He followed her gaze. "Yes," he said. "Like this." She walked him through the service tunnel at 3:20. She knew the route the way she knew her own heartbeat, through the maintenance bay, left at the boiler junction. Up the short flight to the parking structure's service level, and she moved with the confident, unhurried pace of someone who has never needed to pretend she belonged in the places she worked, because she had always belonged there more than anyone else. He moved well for a man who had been cut an hour ago. She noted this. She also noted that he watched her, not the way men sometimes watched her, with the half-attention of people who were interested but not particularly invested. He watched her the way she had watched the hospital corridors for 4 years, learning the system, understanding how it worked, the exits, the rhythms, the particular competence that had been built here through repetition and necessity, and the kind of knowledge that didn't come from studying a map. At the parking structure's service exit, she stopped. "Your people are waiting at River North," she said. "Yes, you can get there from here without Brianna." He said her name with the same precision he brought to everything. Not softly, not as a performance, simply with full attention on the word. "I know where I am." A silence. The rain had shifted from materialization to something more purposeful, driving at an angle off the parking structure's upper levels and finding the service exit with enthusiasm. "Will you be all right?" she said. Not a question exactly, a statement with its ending left open. "Yes," he paused. "Will you?" She blinked. Nobody asked her that. "Of course," she said. "You're soaking wet," he said. "You gave me your jacket 2 hours ago." She had, in fact, forgotten about this. She looked down at her uniform shirt. She had forgotten about the jacket entirely, in the way you forget about things you gave away without thinking, the forgetting itself being the evidence that the giving was genuine. "I'll be fine," she said. 6 blocks. "I'll send a car." You need your jacket back," he said. "And I'd like to not owe a woman who put me back together with a first aid kit and a transit card 6 November blocks in the rain." He held her gaze. "Let me send the car." She looked at him. She thought about the 6 blocks. She thought about the penetrating cold. "Fine," she said. The car arrived in 4 minutes. Before he got into the car that arrived for him, different car, different direction, a man who materialized from the parking structure's upper level, who was very large and very calm. He turned back. "The council members who arranged tonight," he said. "I know who they are. I've known for 2 months. I've been waiting to understand the full architecture before I moved." A pause. "Tonight I have everything I need." She understood, without being told, that he was telling her this because she was the only person who knew where he had been tonight. That this was a form of trust, and that telling her was also a form of protection, giving her the information she would need to understand what was about to happen, so that none of it could be used against her. "Okay," she said. "You should know," he said. "Because you may hear my name in the next week in contexts that are significant. I'll hear your name," she said. "And I'll know you were sitting at the bottom of a stairwell in the rain looking like a man who had made his peace with the cost. I think that's a better version to know." Something moved through his face. She was getting better at reading the specific topography of his expressions, the place where the control had a gap in it, where the person underneath the position was briefly visible. She saw it now, and it was not small. "Yes," he said. "It is." Competence reveal, the ladder first rung. She went back to work the next evening. She had not expected to see him again. Had, in fact, filed the entire previous night under extraordinary circumstances. Do not repeat, and had spent her morning actively avoiding thinking about it. She had returned to the specific functional quiet of her ordinary life. She had texted Deshawn about a scholarship deadline. She had eaten breakfast and slept 4 hours and reported for her shift. At 11:15, Mr. O was waiting in the facilities manager's office. She knew who Mr. O was before he introduced himself, because she had worked at St. Agatha for 4 years, and the Young Sun Group was one of its largest institutional donors, and she had, on 3 separate occasions, coordinated facilities logistics for donor visits that had required specific kinds of access and specific kinds of invisible management. She had handled those visits with the same efficiency she handled everything. Mr. O told her that Mr. Choi wanted to see her at her convenience, that the visit was entirely at her discretion, and that a car was available whenever she was ready. She was quiet for a moment. "Did something go wrong?" she said. Mr. O's expression was professionally neutral. On the contrary, he said. She thought about it for the length of time it took to decide whether she was going to think about it for longer. Tomorrow morning, she said. Before my shift. Second rung. The Youngson Group's Chicago offices occupied the 40th and 41st floors of a building on Wacker that was itself a Youngson construction. All clean lines and intelligent use of light. The kind of building that did not announce itself, but was instantly distinguishable from the buildings around it by a quality of purposefulness that was hard to name and easy to feel. She arrived at 8 in the morning in her regular clothes, which were not the kind of clothes that people typically wore to the 40th floor of buildings on Wacker, and she did not allow herself to feel anything particular about this. She was shown into a conference room with a window that looked out over the river. She had never seen the river from this height before. It looked different, less like a landmark and more like a fact of the city's physics, the thing everything else was organized around. Sung-jin came in without ceremony. He looked entirely recovered, the suit immaculate, the control fully operational except for the specific quality of attention he directed at her, which was the same it had been in the annex. No performance of power, just actual attention. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "You already sent the car. That was courtesy. This is specific." He sat across from her. "You made 3 decisions last night that required information you shouldn't have had access to. You knew not to call an ambulance. You knew the angle of pressure. You knew the annex existed and how to reach it without crossing any street that a person looking for me would have been watching." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this. Yes, you could have sent a note with the car." "I could have," he said. "I wanted to see your face when I said it." "Why?" "Because the decisions were not accidents. You've spent 4 years building a map of how that hospital and the 4 blocks around it actually function versus how they appear to function. And you used that map last night, without hesitation, and without asking me whether I wanted you to." A pause. "Most people in your position would have called an ambulance and let the consequences sort themselves." "The consequences would have sorted themselves onto you," she said. "You had a reason not to call." "I respected the reason." "Yes," he said. "Why?" She thought about this honestly. "Because you weren't performing," she said. "You were sitting at the bottom of those stairs having already done your calculation and you weren't pretending it was fine. I can work with honest. I can't work with people who need me to pretend the situation is something other than what it is." He was quiet. "What is it you actually do at St. Agatha?" He said. "Facilities coordination. In practice." She looked at him. "I know where everything is, and how to move it, and who to call when the system breaks, and how to fix it when there's no time to call anyone. I know the service infrastructure of a 7-building medical campus well enough to route around any problem in it in the dark. I know which external contractors are reliable and which ones are billing for work they're not doing. I know that the loading dock on the south side has a structural issue that facilities submitted a repair request for 18 months ago, and that hasn't been acted on, because the committee that approves it has been waiting for a budget cycle that keeps getting delayed." She paused. "I know the actual version of how things work." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "That's a different skill than you've been hired for," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." Third rung. He asked her, at the end of that meeting, if she would be willing to consult on a specific facilities issue with the Youngson Group's Property Management Division, a problem in one of their mixed-use developments that had been generating complaints for 8 months, and that 3 contracted engineers had failed to diagnose correctly. She asked what the issue was. He described it. She listened. She asked 4 questions, each of which made the previous engineer's diagnosis visibly wrong in a different way, which she could tell from the expression of the facilities manager, who was sitting in on the meeting and whose face was doing the specific recalibration of a person who has just heard a problem they've been circling described from its correct center. "I'd need to see the building," she said. "When?" "I'm free Tuesday." She went on Tuesday. She found the problem in 45 minutes. It was not an engineering failure. It was a maintenance scheduling conflict that had been creating a moisture issue, that had then created a pressure differential, that had then caused the symptom that everyone had been treating as the primary problem. The fix cost $900 and 2 hours of labor. The Yongsan Group's facilities manager looked at her with an expression she recognized as someone revising their understanding of a situation. Sung Jin, who had been present for the walkthrough and said very little, said, "You saw that immediately." "I saw it in 20 minutes, she said. "I spent the other 25 making sure I wasn't wrong. The engineers we hired spent 8 months not finding it. They were looking for an engineering problem," she said. "It wasn't an engineering problem. It was a communication problem between two systems that were both working correctly and creating a failure at the point where they met. That's a different kind of problem. You need someone who thinks about the whole system, not each component separately." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "You do." Fourth rung. 3 weeks after the stairwell, she was walking through the Yongsan Group's Riverside development. She had been asked back twice more by then, for different properties, and had been navigating a set of feelings about this that she had not yet finished navigating, when she overheard a conversation that she was not supposed to hear. 2 men in the building management office talking about a council meeting. Names she recognized from the news cycle of the past week, in which 3 senior figures in the Yongsan Group had stepped down from their positions, which the press release had described as a restructuring, and which she had understood, from the specific quality of language around it, to be something else entirely. She heard her name. Specifically, she heard one man say to the other, in Korean, that the Okafor woman needed to be handled carefully, that she had been present on the night, and that this made her a variable. She understood Korean. She had learned it in a specific way, through the particular circumstance of a Korean-American neighbor who had taken an interest in Deshawn when he was 14 and failing math, and who had, over the following 3 years, become the closest thing to a family figure they had outside their own. She had learned it because it had been spoken in her home. She carried it the way she carried everything she had learned through proximity to people she loved, quietly, without announcement, as a fact of who she was. She finished her walkthrough. She returned to the management office, set her site notes on the desk, and looked at both men with the specific calm of someone who has decided to simplify a situation. "I want you to tell Mr. Choi," she said, in Korean, "that I heard that, and that I am not a variable to be handled. I am a person who made a decision at 2 in the morning because it was the right decision, and I have made every subsequent decision on the same basis." She held the eye of the man who had spoken. "And if someone in this organization decides that makes me a problem, they should say so to me directly. I don't do secondhand." Both men were very still. She picked up her bag. "I'll send the site report by end of day," she said, in English, and left. Rising tension, he called her 40 minutes later. "They told me," he said. "I assumed they would. Are you all right?" She was on the train, heading back toward St. Agatha for her evening shift. The train was doing what Chicago trains always did in November, making its way through the elevated sections with the particular shriek of metal that sounded like the city complaining about the cold. "I'm fine," she said. I want you to know I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear it. I don't do that. I know, he said. That is not what I'm calling to ask. Then what are you calling to ask? A pause. The specific pause of a man who had spent 16 years being precise in his communications, encountering a moment that resisted precision. I'm calling, he said, because I have been thinking about what you said. In the annex. About architecture. About buildings designed to work for the people inside them. She waited. The council restructuring has left a significant gap in the group's property development division. A structural problem, not engineering. Communication, systems that are both functioning and creating failures at the points where they meet. Another pause. I need someone who thinks about the whole system. She was quiet for a moment. That's a significant ask, she said. Yes, I don't have corporate credentials. You have 4 years of functional infrastructure expertise, a demonstrable ability to diagnose problems that specialists missed, and the specific quality of judgment that I observed at 2 in the morning and have been observing for the last 3 weeks. He paused. The credentials can be acquired. The judgment can't. She looked out the train window at the city moving past, the rooftops and the water towers and the elevated infrastructure of a place that had been built by people who had understood that cities were systems, and that systems required someone who knew how to hold the whole picture in their head while keeping their hands on the specific problem in front of them. I need to think about it, she said. Of course. And I need you to tell me something. Yes, the men in the management office, she said. Were they part of what happened on Mercy Street? A silence. The question you're really asking, he said, is whether you are safe. Yes, they were. They are no longer in a position to be relevant to your safety or anything else. A pause. I want you to know that independently of everything else, not as a business negotiation, as a fact. She was quiet for a moment. The train entered an underground section and the window went dark. Okay, she said. Is that enough? She thought about the stairwell, about the specific quality of a man who had been sitting in the rain with his hand pressed to his side, not performing composure but actually in possession of it, looking at her like she was a fact of the situation rather than a complication of it. It's enough, she said. He made the declaration 11 days later, in a room full of people who understood exactly what it cost him. The Yongsan Group's quarterly operations review. 43 people in a room on the 41st floor. The restructured council, the division heads, the external partners who had flown in from Seoul and Singapore. The precise architecture of everything he had built, arrayed around a table that cost more than most people's cars. He walked in with Brianna Okafor. Not as a consultant, not as a guest. As the person he was introducing as the new Director of Infrastructure Operations, a title that had not existed in the organization 2 weeks ago and had been created with the specific intention of housing a competence the organization needed and had never had language for. She wore a suit she had bought 2 days before, which fit correctly because she had spent 2 days' salary on it and it was worth it. And she carried a leather folio that contained 3 months of sight, reports, and 1 restructuring proposal that she had written at her. Kitchen table at 5 in the morning on the back of not enough sleep and a clarity about what needed to be fixed that had been building in her since the first Tuesday walkthrough. The room was quiet in the specific way of rooms adjusting to new information. He did not explain or justify or contextualize. He introduced her, stated the role, indicated that the first initiatives under her purview would begin the following Monday, and moved on to the next agenda item. One of the Seoul partners, an older man who had been with the Yongsan Group since before Sung Jin inherited it, said, in Korean, to the man beside him, something that translated approximately as, "Where did she come from?" Sung Jin heard it. He did not look at the man. He said, in Korean, calmly, and to the room, "She covered me when I needed it." The rest is her own work. The room understood, in the way that rooms full of people who know what his words cost him understand, exactly what that meant. Brianna, who had also understood it, kept her face entirely neutral and her hand still on the leather folio and did not let him see, until they were in the elevator afterward, the specific expression that she was carrying. "You did not need to say that," she said. "No," he said. "I chose to." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the attention that had been building incrementally since a stairwell and a jacket and a first aid kit and an annex that smelled of old linoleum and institutional quiet. "The jacket," she said. "You still have it?" "Yes, I want it back." "I know," he said. "Come and get it." The choice, she thought about it for 3 days. She thought about it in the mornings before her alarm, when the city was still mostly dark, and her mind ran through things without the organizing principle of urgency. She thought about what it would mean to stay. Not just in the role was already decided. She had made that decision in the train, and she did not unmake decisions, but to stay in the fuller sense of the word that she understood him to be offering. She had not let herself be in that sense of the word for a long time. She had reasons. She had good reasons. 7 years of a life organized around a single purpose had created a very specific kind of discipline. And discipline required you to know which things you were saying no to in order to say yes to the thing you had decided mattered most. Deshawn had 1 year left. 1 year, and he would be done, and she could look at the architecture of her own life and decide what she was building it toward. She had been telling herself, for 7 years, that the decision would happen then. That there was a future Brianna who would have the luxury of that kind of decision, and that the present Brianna's job was to get there. She thought, "I have been waiting for my own life to have permission to begin," she thought. A woman who can read a hospital campus in the dark at 2 in the morning and fix a problem in 45 minutes that 3 engineers missed in 8 months is not a woman who needed to wait. She was a woman who had been waiting out of habit. Out of the specific discipline that had served her so well for so long that she had forgotten to ask, periodically, whether it was still the right tool for the current situation. She texted Deshawn. Not about the new role. She would tell him about that in person, with the pleasure of watching his face do the thing it always did when he was proud of her, which was to try very hard to look casual about it, and fail. She texted, "I think I've been putting my life in queue behind itself. Thought you should know. You're going to be fine. You've been fine. I just needed to say it out loud." He texted back in 40 seconds, Bri. "I have been fine. Go live your life." She laughed. First time in a while. The specific laugh of someone who has been holding something down for long enough that releasing it surprises them. She called Sung Jin. "I'm coming to get my jacket," she said. A silence. The kind that was not empty. "I know," he said, "and I want to talk about the infrastructure proposal. Section 3. "I think you read it wrong." "I read it correctly," he said. "I disagreed with one element. Then we should disagree about it in person." "Yes," he said, "we should." She could hear it in his voice. That same thing she had heard in the annex. Beneath the control, beneath the whole architecture of what he was. A man coming back to a room that had been closed. A system communicating correctly with another system for the first time in a long time. No pressure differential, no failure at the junction point. Just 2 things working together in a way that made both of them work better. "I'll be there at 7, she said. "I'll be here," he said. She put the phone down. She looked out the window at Chicago in November, gray and specific and entirely itself, a city that ran on the invisible labor of people who knew how its bones worked, that held its shape because of the people in its infrastructure who understood it from the inside. She thought, "I know this city. I have known it for 7 years, from its service tunnels and its loading docks and its overnight corridors, and it turned out that someone in it had been paying attention." And he gave her the jacket at 7:03. She held it for a moment, her too large, perfectly warm, utterly unremarkable uniform jacket, and she thought about what it had cost her to give it away without thinking, which was nothing, which was less than nothing, which was a reflex born from 7 years of giving away what she had without accounting for it, and what it had returned to her, which was a thing she had not known she was missing until it arrived. She put the jacket on. He looked at her in it, in the specific way of a man who has been thinking about a single image for 3 weeks and is now in the room with it, and his face did the thing it did. The gap in the control. The actual person briefly completely present. "You look like you," he said. "I am me," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been watching." Outside, Chicago went on being Chicago, relentless, structural, built on the invisible work of people who kept it standing. The river moved through it at its own pace. The rain had stopped. The city's lights came up off the wet pavement in the particular way that made everything look briefly like its own reflection. Familiar and different at once. The same and also new. She had a meeting at 9. A proposal to defend, a city's worth of infrastructure to learn from a new height. She stayed for all of it. My bold hearts and midnight witnesses, if this one reached something in you tonight, give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you're here for every story we tell, and drop your city in the comments. I want this map covered. Every country, every coast, every time zone that stayed up for this. You are the reason. Next time, we find out what Deshaun says when he finally meets Sung Jin, and Sung Jin finds out what it means when a man like him has to earn the approval of a 24-year-old environmental engineering student who has his sister's entire history memorized. That one is going to be a ride. I'll see you there.